Hello, I'm Jerry Crow of the Pacifica Historical Society, and today's host of the show Footprints of Pacifica, where we get together every week to discover and explore the lure and lore of lovely Pacifica, its character, and its characters. The focus of today's show is nearby Half Moon Bay. Our guest Dave Cresson is here to talk about the history of that town and about the Half Moon Bay History Association. Welcome, Dave. Why don't we start with a little of your personal history? How did you come to the coast in the first place?
Well, Jerry, I'm ashamed and embarrassed to admit I'm not a native Californian. Actually, I was born in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, outside of Philadelphia, a little place called Bryn Mawr, and worked around Bryn Mawr and Philadelphia for a number of years till I wandered out to Princeton, and then went to work in New York City as a marketing research guy. I was one of those survey statistician wonks that gathers information from consumers across this wonderful country of ours for the purpose of taking their opinions and figuring out how we can use their own minds to persuade them to buy the products that we're interested in. So I worked in Manhattan and New York City for quite a number of years after I got out of college, which, by the way, I went to school in Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania, and worked for American brands, and had this wonderful job offer in a place called San Francisco. And this is really embarrassing, but I was divided between a job offer in San Francisco and a job offer in Minneapolis, and I was only trying to figure out which one would be the best for my career. And I realized the error of my ways when I got to Moss Beach.
That would do it all right.
Now, you might wonder how I got to Moss Beach instead of Walnut Creek or even Pacifica. And the answer is I knew from my experience in New Jersey, that's where Princeton is, and New York, that I wanted to live by the beach this time. Of course, my job in San Francisco was in the ferry building, and I could see there was a wonderful highway link that ran right down the coast between the ferry building and Pacifica. So I thought, Pacifica is the place. Look at that, the beach right at my footsteps. I can go dashing into the beach in my bathing shorts after work, and life is going to be good. I think I also found out that didn't work so well. But when I drove down that highway and came to Pacifica, it looked a little bit crowded for my beach fantasy that I had. And I thought if I go south, maybe it'll lighten up a little bit. And I went over this remarkable mountain that was just to the south of Pacifica. And as I went up and saw 800 feet below my car, the roaring Pacific hitting against cliffs, and then when the road opened to nothing but farmland, I said, this is the place. So how did I get to Moss Beach is really the question, eventually to Half Moon Bay. It was just a question of getting a nice, easy commute so that I could go sunbathing after work and go to work during the day and not thinking of much else.
The right environment.
It was just perfect except for one detail. You don't go swimming in the Pacific Ocean the way you do in the
warmer on the Atlantic coast. Yeah. Well, that's quite a story, all right. Was your interest in history something that you acquired along in here somewhere, or it doesn't sound like it was part of your academic program?
Well, it really wasn't. I've always been interested in old things and old buildings, and a mild interest in history, no more interest than any other schoolboy would have. But your word choice, as you asked that question, was my interest in history something that I acquired, is exactly right. I did go to work in the ferry building, working as a marketing guy for a farmer-owned cooperative, and then went into my own business as a market researcher and wanted to set up shop in Half Moon Bay and San Francisco and South City. So I needed an office. And there was this derelict old building on Main Street, Half Moon Bay, nondescript, practically impossible to even notice. But I could see easily it was an old building, which looked fun. It was in bad condition, which means it was in my price range. And I bought it to set up our offices there. Shortly after I got there, a wonderful lady came knocking on the front door and said, "Do you realize what a treasure you have in this house?" She said, "This house was owned by a fellow by the name of Zabala. Zabala came to California in the 1850s and built this house. And nobody seems to realize that it has any historic significance. I hope you don't follow your real estate broker's instructions and suggestions and tear it down and put a shopping center in here. Please keep it, it's important." And that's how I literally acquired my interest in history.
And this is as it looked after you had a chance to fix it up a little, I presume.
That's the gussied up and better groomed Zabala house. It looks almost like that today. Physically, the house itself does. But sadly, the cypress trees are gone and development did take place, and it's now surrounded by a modest little shopping center that's built in the same character of look, but a lot more modern. Has the same look as the Zabala house. But that's it, and it was after my offices closed there, moved elsewhere, it became a little bed and breakfast.
Well, that was a good achievement to be able to retain it and at the same time make good use of it.
Well, thanks.
You're welcome. So I guess at some stage you got more formally involved in history, and you're the founder, is probably a correct word, for the Half Moon Bay History Association. So how did that come into being?
Well, it really does go back to that Zabala house again. Once it was turned into a bed and breakfast, we proudly announced, as it turned out, that the Zabala house is one of the oldest buildings in Half Moon Bay. We figure it was built about 1855. Nobody knows for sure because there were no tax records of no building permits in those days. So we proudly announced as part of the brochure for the Zabala house that it is among the very oldest buildings on the coast, rivaled nearby only by the Johnston House, which also presumably was built in about 1855. Most of the folks in Half Moon Bay are very familiar with the Johnston House, a wonderful job of restoring that in recent years. So I said, when I retire and have some time, I'll write a little one-page document to explain to the guests at the Zabala house why Zabala and his house are significant in coastside or Half Moon Bay history. And when it was time to retire, I sat down to write my one-page description of why Zabala was important. And the one page grew a little bit more because I thought I should describe a little bit about the community that Zabala lived in at the time. And then I realized that describing Zabala's time, the 1850s and 1860s, wouldn't make much sense if you didn't tell what had come before. And of course, immediately realized that you ought to say what happens afterwards. And the next thing I knew, Jerry, if you'll forgive me for
yes,
showing you a prop.
Be glad to hold that up for you.
I turned out writing a book that brought together all the stories written by virtually all the other authors who have tried to capture a spirit of the coastside, which for literary purposes will describe the coastside as being from Devil's Slide down to, say, the end of the 3 great land grants that took us down to a little town called Purissima. So from Devil's Slide, just south of Pacifica, to Purissima, 3 land grants to the south, I tried to get all of the interesting little anecdotes, the fun stories about grizzly bears and mountain lions and wild, well, the proper word for wild Indians would be wild Indians. The more correct word would be wild Native Americans. And So we included a bit of that. We had some bandits. One of the nephews of one of those 3 land grant owners was a fellow by the name of Tiburcio Vasquez, a wonderful name, not very well known as important and prominent San Franciscan, which is why he got the land grant, but his nephew was chased halfway across Northern California because he used to make a habit of holding people up and taking their money. He was quite a character, by the way. In the end, when he was finally caught after having his way as a lawless fellow, he was celebrated by all the ladies of the Northern California as the great ladies' man, and really was mourned until the day that he went before his firing squad. So that's how I got interested in history.
Character. Yeah. Well, that's obviously rewarding for you.
So that went on, and we started collecting artifacts and things that were worth sharing with the public to go with the book, and various papers and deeds and old bottles. Just started, the flame began to boil. And we wondered where we could put these things, and we set one room of the Zabala house aside and said, let's take a room away from the guests and put what we'd love to call a museum, but the room is so small that I guess we'll have to more modestly call it a history room. But we put a little history room into the Zabala house and started putting some of these artifacts and interesting papers and old deeds and so forth into that room, and realized, boy, this is getting awfully official. Maybe we better get some insurance in case somebody trips and falls, and if we do that, we don't want to get the bed and breakfast involved in any lawsuit. Let's make a separate insurable entity, and let's make it a history association. And so indeed, we set up a separate tax-deductible, nonprofit, 501c3, all that legal stuff that the IRS demands. And the next thing we knew, we had not only a history room and a whole lot of artifacts, but a whole lot of people that were getting more and more interested in helping to share the weight of sharing history with the coast side and Half Moon Bay, in the same way that your fabulous Pacifica Historical Society has many members.
Thank you very much for that. You publish an outstanding newsletter. I'd like to show an example for the camera.
Well, that is an example, and we at first started publishing our quarterly newsletter faithfully at least twice a year. And we've gradually, this was 5 years or so ago, Jerry, that the History Association began. And it took us probably 2 years to get a newsletter started and another year to get our quarterly newsletter, so it was actually quarterly. And it's becoming great fun. We've got contributing authors. This particular one that you're holding up talks about how Grizzlies meet the early settlers. And it's a story that was written by, we call it the retrospective, the Half Moon Bay retrospective. And it was written by what we call a staff writer, who happens to be Stacy Trevennan, who is a name that may be known to you because she's the reporter for the Half Moon Bay Review, who was kind of double timing with that story.
Oh, good for her.
And I might further add, this is a president's message next to it. Gee, I didn't know I brought such a good newsletter for you to show today. So the president's message, of course, is authored by the president. That would be none other than me. And you'll notice in this thing, that's me, and it's me standing next to a great water wheel. And of course, there are no water wheels in Half Moon Bay, but there is a Mill Street. And I'd often wondered, why does Mill Street have that name, Mill Street? And it turns out that there's a wonderful story. Of course, there was a flour mill at the end of Mill Street, built by a fellow named Halstead. And in this, I'm at the bale mill near St. Helena, getting all of the dimensions. There's no picture of that old mill. There's no sign of what it is. But we got it into our head that we should build a model of a mill to put in a diorama of old Half Moon Bay.
Excellent.
And that diorama would go into that history room. So there I am trying to figure out what the old bale
Prototype.
mill looked like.
Excellent. Well, that brings us to the general topic that we're here to discuss in the history of Half Moon Bay itself. So since you now have delved deeply into that topic, where did you begin? What was your beginning of time regarding the Half Moon Bay history story?
Well, I think that no story of Half Moon Bay or Pacifica could be more interesting told than to say, geologically speaking, at one time, of course, we were underwater. I live in a house now that sits 800 feet above sea level, and yet I can go back in our backyard and dig through the earth and dig up old clamshells. An amazing thing. And it's amazing, absolutely stunning to me, who has little education in geology, that we were underwater, now we're above water. When the Ice Age ended, right where we're sitting, which is virtually at sea level, was 400 feet above sea level, and we could walk to the Farallones. It's an amazing thing. 5,700 years ago, the natives first showed up, according to carbon dating that we know of. So if we were to start to talk about history in a timeline or chronologically, I guess we would probably start about the Ohlonies, which is what they called themselves. The Spanish, of course, when they discovered them, called them Costanoans, people of the coast. And we ever so politically incorrect Americans called them Indians because we thought we must be in India when we first ran across them, and now we politely speak of them as the Native Americans. But there were Native Americans, Ohlonies, scattered all along the seaboard of California. And just the interesting side note on them, I was taught to think of natives as being hunters or as gatherers, and there's always the issue, are they hunters or gatherers? And according to the experts, of which I'm certainly not one, they were foragers. The Ohlonies were, and the reason they were foragers is because there was so much at their feet that they could eat that they didn't have to gather and put it aside and save their acorns for a rainy day. They had the ocean right at their feet. They could go in and get mussels and clams and abalone and all the like. So our first predecessors in California were the Ohlonies. And they, of course, were soon displaced when exploration began. You probably know, being a historian yourself, that what was that date? 1569, I think, that a fellow by the name of Sir Francis, not Sir yet, Francis Drake, was the first European to come to the coast of California and landed at a place called today, of all things, Drake's Bay. Did you know there was some controversy that he might not have landed at Drake's Bay? He might have landed at Half Moon Bay. The geography, according to his diary fellow, was described Drake's Bay in almost exactly the same words that you would have described Half Moon Bay in those days. And they're
Now, that's a new one for me. That's interesting.
There's some serious students that think that's true. Of course, you may remember also that there was a brass plaque made by Sir Francis Drake, which he duly reported in his diary that he was going to leave at the landing spot. And he did, dedicating this place to Queen Elizabeth, I think it was. And according to his diary, he left it there. And in the 30s, people around Drake's Bay actually found the brass plaque engraved almost exactly as he described it.
Well, I wonder how
I'm
do you
going to finish that story if you don't mind me jumping in.
okay.
It wasn't until the 90s or 2000 that the students of a history professor in San Francisco said, "We planted that brass
Oh, yes,
plaque."
well,
So
I had heard that part of it.
it was all debunked. So that Half Moon Bay story still has to be dealt with.
It shows you history can be fun.
Now, I did interrupt you.
Well, I was interested in where the title of Half Moon Bay was first applied. Was that, you suppose the Indians called it something similar to that, or how did that come to be?
Well, the Indians didn't speak English, so I don't think they called it Half Moon Bay.
You know, a rough translation.
The only thing that I know is that Half Moon Bay appears to be named by the Coastal Survey folks on their maps, and they're describing that
so many
crescent-shaped bay that's headed by Pillar Point, the same one we were talking about before.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to continue the chronology, it was the Spanish that did come. Portola comes marching through Half Moon Bay to Pacifica, of all things. We argue that it might have been Montara, but I think that one's been thoroughly debunked. Went to a place called Sweeney Ridge, discovered San Francisco Bay, and was soon followed. De Portola was soon followed in 1776, a year that was really quite interesting in American history. At almost exactly the same moment that the Liberty Bell was tolling in Philadelphia to declare America's independence from the Crown, the first shovelful of Mission Dolores was being turned in San Francisco, and the Spanish were established. And Spanish reigned over this territory, made it a point to civilize those Ohlonies, and brought them into their missions, taught them Spanish ways, but it didn't take too long until the Mexicans took over for the Spanish. 1821, I think, was the year that Mexico established its independence from Spain. And that's a crucial year for coastside history, because that was what triggered these land grants that took these vast properties that used to belong to Spain, then belonged momentarily to the Mexicans, and gave it to the Mexicans. And the three land grants that we deal with on our coast side, the one big one for you, of course, was given to Sanchez the Younger here for Pacifica, but a fellow named Guerrero, a fellow named Vasquez, Tiburcio. Anybody good on Spanish to give me Tiburcio?
I would call it a soft C.
Okay.
Followed by an I.
That brings me this.
Yes. A nice model of?
This model serves two purposes. It's the best take that we have, and it's in the diorama in the history room, of what Miramontes' adobe in Half Moon Bay looked like. And the structural details, by the way, we took from the Sanchez adobe. And the other reason I show it is to remind us that there is a diorama of 1861 Half Moon Bay in that history room that's being built by master model builders. All the buildings of that survey, 1861, are being included, and I welcome anyone to come see that history room in the Zabala House and share some of our joy for history.
And that's located at, what's the street address of Zabala?
The Zabala House is 324 Main Street, right in the center of town.
Yeah, you cross the bridge heading south.
Cross the bridge that was the first steel reinforced bridge in San Mateo County, by the way.
Yeah.
And the next thing you know, you're at the Zabala House on your right-hand side at 324. So the Mexicans, of course, were moved aside with the gold rush, and Americans came rushing in and had delusions of grandeur about free farmland and the like, but the greatest delusion of all was about if we could get a railroad to come down the coast. And I brought some pictures just to make this chat a little more entertaining. We'll get this out of your way.
Let's show a few of these. We'll have to rush right along.
Sure.
We have just a minute or two left.
The railroad came in 1906, and that was a great turning point for the coast side because it brought a real estate boom, at least in the sense that all the land was subdivided into building lots and the like. And there were stations that marched from Moss Beach all the way to Half Moon Bay. And did the railroad bring a building boom? No, but it brought a real estate boom because everything was subdivided. I don't think I have enough time to share most of these, Jerry.
Probably not. This was kind of an interesting one to my mind. You might.
Well, this is part of the dream of the railroad was that the coast side was going to become a resort area for San Franciscans to come, a Riviera for San Francisco, and this was a place called Nye's Reefs, which was a restaurant, bar, dance band, dance floor for the visitors that came on the railroad. And of course, that wonderful place built on the beach didn't last very long. It was wiped out by a great sea storm. So what the railroad left behind was all the subdivisions that eventually have come to become what the coast side is, not because they were built then, but because when World War II came and went and people began to zoom into Half Moon Bay, then we built in the 50s and the 60s, and that's what we have today.
Well, Dave, we're out of time now, and it's too bad to leave out any of the details of the very colorful history of Half Moon Bay. But this has been very interesting, and I thank you very much for being here to help us out in this way. For those who might be interested in getting involved in history, I think on the screen you've seen the contact information for the History Association of Half Moon Bay. For the Pacifica History Society, our address is Post Office Box 752, Pacifica 94044. Our website is pacificahistory.org, and the telephone number is 650-359-5462. Thanks for watching our show, and as you know, we like to close with a quote from Longfellow. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing, leave behind us footprints in the sands of time. Thank you.